Panel here today is about open source streaming. I'm Jason Thibeault, I'm the Executive Director of the Streaming Video Alliance. I literally got back from Madrid yesterday, and I might pass out at any time, so if I do, they will take over. What we're going to talk about are open source components, how they're being used, what's being used, favorites, not favorites, cool things to do with them, not to do with them, etc. Executive Director of Streaming Video Alliance, we're an industry association, and what we do is bring people together from various companies to solve critical technical challenges, like how to build things, best practices to deployment, things like that. Take a look at the website, streamingvideoalliance.org, if you're interested. What we're going to do first is run through introductions, and then once we do the introductions, we'll jump into questions, and then hopefully at the end, we'll save a little bit of time for you, the audience, to voice your questions to our panelists. So let's start off to my left.
Hi, my name is Yuriy Reznik. I'm with Brightcove. I'm head of research group at this company, and I've been doing streaming for a while. My first video streaming product was Real Video in 1997.
I'm Rob Dillon. I was formerly the digital operations manager for Tribune Broadcasting. I've been involved in the streaming arena since before anybody called it streaming back in the 90s with radio stations, and I've just progressed along. At Tribune, I was responsible for all of our live streaming setups, and our OTT, VOD, SVO, or not, we don't do SVO, our OTT, VOD products, as well as our connected home and all that fun stuff, Alexa. So.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rema Morgan-Aluko. I work at Fandango. I'm the engineering director for the FandangoNOW platform, which is our transactional video-on-demand streaming service. I have worked at Fandango for the past 13 years, mainly before I focused on the ticketing business. And I got into video about 6 years ago and been running the FandangoNOW team for about 3 years. I am really interested about everything video, and I can really speak to the whole engineering workflow and how we build that to put out great video.
My name is Steve Heffernan. I'm a head of product at Mux. We have a video performance monitoring product and video streaming APIs. Before Mux, I was at Brightcove building the video player there, and before that at Zencoder building a transcoding API. And at Zencoder, I built Video.js, the open source video player, and that project is still going today.
Awesome. So a lot of great panelists here with a ton of experience in terms of software engineering as it relates to video streaming. So this is going to be fantastic. All right, let's start out with questions. So the first one, obviously there's lots of open source components that we use today in video streaming workflows. There's some really popular ones like Nginx and Video.js, obviously, so lots of people using the player, FFmpeg. What are some of the more well-known tools that people are using today? I mean, what are some of the tools that you guys are using in your workflows? Anybody can answer.
Well, on the broadcasting side, most of my television stations are using OBS and also Audacity to edit their, like Amazon Home, their Alexa flash briefings, and the product most of you I can't talk today, JT, and you're the one who's been flying for a month.
I'm so intimidating.
Most TV stations will also cut news or weather for a radio station, because radio stations don't employ Mets or news people anymore, so they also use Audacity for that. And those are huge in our local stations.
Anybody else?
It seems like there's an open source project for just about every piece of the stack. I mean, I can think of captioning. There's good tools there. A lot around packaging. I remember at Zencoder we used FFmpeg, but we also used a bunch of other tools. Like we were using mencoder and mplayer and a bunch of other ones that, like, if one open source project didn't do something well, you'd find something else that kind of did that one little piece a little bit better. And then you get projects like OBS, which is the Open Broadcast Software, I think is the last one. And that's like the most popular streamer for Twitch gaming streamers. Like they'll load that up on their desktop. So, yeah.
We use Bento 4 for dash packaging, and then on the player side, we build our own players where we can, and we use ExoPlayer on the Android side, and then we use Dash.js on the web for our Dash playback.
Well, I guess I'm the last. So on client side, it's all open source just because it's JS, and we use VideoJS, which of course Steve helped to start. But of course, we have the pleasure of carrying on the project and maintaining it and developing it and expanding it. And of course, on the transcoding stack, we used to use lots of open source components, but it's actually on transition out. So we do more of developed in-house technologies, and that's basically the trade-offs that I think everyone is doing. You start with something that's out there, that's accessible, but once you build expertise, once you know what you're doing in certain area, you start doing something more advanced.
No, I mean, that's a really good point, right? So, obviously, quick question. How many people in the audience currently use any open source components as part of their video stack? So 1 back 2, 3, 4, yeah, so quite a few, right? So obviously everyone has an opinion about sort of what I want to ask next, which is what are the benefits of using open source? So is it just to, have access to a big community? Is it because you can get expertise developed in-house and then do your own thing? I mean, what are the benefits? Save costs, save money, anything? You're first. Rema's first.
Okay, I'm it. I think using open source technologies are great because one, they're free. I think that saving costs is really, really important when we're trying to put out great video. It's really important to kind of focus our efforts on the things that make us unique. At FandangoNOW, we're really focused on quality. And so obviously we use FFmpeg, just like most of you in the room, to do a lot of things. And for us, it's really, really important to use those open source components and also build on top of it to really customize and focus on the quality. So I think there is a delicate balance between building things yourself versus using what's out there. I don't think there is any solution that would work, at least on the VOD space, where you can build something using all open source and no commercial, or all commercial and no open source. I think that there is a healthy balance between the two, and you're constantly juggling costs, throughput, quality when you're thinking about what tools to use. And that's what we're doing at FandangoNOW.
Yeah, Rob, so I think you'd have an interesting perspective to add to this too, because you're coming from, kind of the same as Rema's perspective. It's a commercial service that you're providing to end users. So when you were at Tribune, what were some of the benefits you saw of open source, and did you have that balance?
It depended on what side of the equation we were on. So like our local stations, station engineers really don't talk digital very well. So, and they also don't like to give their money to digital at all. So a lot of our stations found OBS on their own. And then I was actually late to that party. I remember when they were in a back alley of NAB and we looked at them and then I forgot about them. And now all of a sudden all my stations are using them because it's an easy way for them to get on Facebook. They can stream to our Akamai provider, and they understand how to do it, and it's very easy for them. The same with Audacity. Now, on the other side, for me, like FFmpeg, I use it because it does everything. I mean, you need a rocket science degree to do some of it, but I know I can check to see if something's corrupt. I can troubleshoot with it. I can use it to do the weirdest transcode in the world when a advertiser provides us a file none of us have ever heard from. FFmpeg has heard of it, and it will translate it. Same with VLC. I can use VLC to test all my other things before I give it out. So on the broadcast, at the station, the local level, who is I consider my user, it's ease of use. But then on the other hand, I can turn around and some of these other ones and just go hog wild geek into them to figure things out. So it just depends.
I just want to add a little bit to that because I think FFmpeg being so powerful that you can do so many things with it. We have some audio video engineers on my team, and they've been in this business for over 20 years. And one of them, we call them the encyclopedia for FFmpeg, because he's familiar with all the commands and all the plugins. And so whenever we run into different issues, because again, we're really focused on quality, we have the largest number of 4K titles, HDR titles on our platform. And in order to do that, there are some complex things that we'll need to do with FFmpeg, and we have that knowledge and expertise. But I don't know if everyone has that. And I think that open source can be great because there's power to do a bunch of different things, but it also can be really hard because there's power to do a bunch of different things. And if you don't know what you need to do, your solution may not be as great as the next person that's using the exact same tool.
Yeah, I would kind of try to strike a balance. There are some things that open source is good at, and there are some things it's not. So what it is good at is at maintaining the enormous capability to decode and support all sorts of legacy formats that existed since 80s and 90s. FFmpeg has disassembled and converted to C codes that I wrote for real video, for example. I didn't contribute it, Real Networks didn't contribute it, somebody decrypted streams and decrypted tables and managed to put it in. And same is with many other formats that were never openly disclosed and documented by their creators. So if you're looking at supporting something very esoteric, chances are FFmpeg will have that decoder and that format support. It's not guaranteed it will do it correctly, but at least it will have something. Now, what I would advise not to use FFmpeg and VLC is to try to test compliance of streams according to standards. For that, I'm sorry to say, please use stream analyzers, please use Syncore, CMA 1280, and other tools. FFmpeg in many cases implements 15% of the standard, and 85% is not there in that code. So if you really want to say what's happening with your PTS, DTS, with your VBV buffer and other things, please use right tools.
You want to add anything, Steve? I mean, I know that, so the difference here is you got like two service providers in the middle and then two people on the end who are building services for companies like them to use. So how, what is the, in your term, what are the benefits or sort of the balance you strike?
Yeah, I think it certainly just depends on the project itself. I guess if you're evaluating between building it yourself in open source, I would hope that you would lean towards working with an open source project, contributing back and kind of helping that community grow. As somebody who leads a project, obviously I'm biased there, but that's an important piece of giving back to the community. If you're evaluating between open source and proprietary, then obviously there's some considerations there, but you're probably looking most at either it's a small open source project that does one thing really well, and you're not going to need it to do much more, and then great, if it does what you need, then use it and run with it. Otherwise, if it's a bigger thing like FFmpeg, right, it really depends on can you trust the community to continue to build out what you're going to need in the future. And in some cases, with a project like that, they can actually stay ahead of even some proprietary solutions, not on everything, but in things like, AV1 decoding and encoding, right? You're going to see that show up in FFmpeg before you see it anywhere else, just because the passionate community behind that thing. So if you can find some of those key projects, those are worth investing in. Otherwise, if the community is kind of shaky, you might be in a place down the road where, there hasn't been a new commit to that code in years, and you're stuck, reevaluating back where you were.
And thank you, because that is the greatest segue ever to my next question. So what is or are the selection criteria for open source, right? Is it support? So for example, I'm sure if I ask the question, I will. How many people in the room use Nginx? Yeah. So Nginx OSS is their open source, right? Huge community, right? Big community, but Nginx Plus is their commercial supported version. Still open source, still based on the open source components, but it's got extra stuff in it and it's got support. So what are some of the selection criteria for open source? Is it there's a supported version I can lean on, or there's a huge community, or it's proven implementations, there's some use cases around this piece of open source has helped Disney Plus launch their service, something like that. What are can anybody give me some thoughts on what are some of the selection criteria you go through?
I could speak for what we do at Fandango. So I would say the selection criteria for open source technologies as it relates to video are the same as what you would do for deciding what type of software or what type of open source you use for anything that you're building, actually. First and foremost, does this piece of software do what you need it to do? Does it have the features that you're looking for? And then second, I think you said that greatly. I think the community is really, really important. You don't want to work with a product that has no support, that has no one adding to it, because what happens? When you need something, are you going to rely on the community to do it, or do you need to actually add to it yourself? Do you need to contribute to the community yourself and there's no one else helping you? That could be a waste. So I think that first and foremost, it's really about what can this tool do for you? Is it backed by a great community? And I don't know if there's that much value, at least personally to me, if there's a bunch of other folks using something or big names using something. It's really about, does it work for me and my team? Do we have the expertise to plug it into our system? We spend a lot of time building systems so that we can plug and play different tools. Will this work in with the rest of our ecosystem? Yes? No? If no, we're not using it.
Anybody else want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would second that on just making sure that you have the team to implement it and back it up. And I mean, you know, there's details like with FFmpeg, if you put the input parameter in the wrong place, like it's going to have different results, and like you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you actually spend time with it and learn some of these things and learn how to optimize. And you know, that's very different from a proprietary system where you can call up support and read a manual, and not that FFmpeg has a manual, but there's a lot going on in there. Yeah. So yeah, totally. Like you just got to know what you're getting into.
So in my view, there is really two-step decision logic here, whether to use open source or not. First is, you try to think, do you really want to invest in that area or not? Or is this your core expertise, or this is not your core expertise? You still need to have this functionality in your system to build a product, but you really, if you don't really want to invest in it, then there is second question. And the second question it is between, let's select a vendor who does it, who provides this SDK or provides this functionality, or let's try to look around, maybe there is an open source project that does the same thing. And then if you try to look between a third-party vendor doing it versus open source, the first question is maturity, completeness, how credible it is, how proven it is. And if the difference between commercial implementation and open source is not significant, well, maybe open source is good enough.
And with us being broadcasters, it really kind of boiled down to what the purpose of the product was. We ran very lean. We didn't have a lot of people. Even with me having direct technical reports, we didn't have a lot of time. You know, I've been in this forever, so I could basic command lines for FFmpeg and stuff, but for a player, which is mission critical for us, I was at 43 TV stations and a cable network, and the player was critical, and I loved what you did, but I had to have somebody, if it broke, I could call and scream at, because I didn't have enough people to sit there and work with you or work with the community. So we ended up going with an outside vendor who I believe is based on your work. I'm not 100% sure, because I liked your product. It's just I couldn't support it myself. And I had to have, if it broke, I had to have support. You know, OBS is kind of interesting in the fact that sometimes you can get the community to listen to you, and other times the questions don't get answered ever. So the community behind it also plays a lot to do with it, because if I'm going to expect my neophytes at the TV stations to support themselves on these products, the community better not be old and mature and cranky like me, like the FFmpeg community is, whereas a newbie comes in, I mean, they're torn to shreds like it's a feeding time. So I have to also look at that. I mean, it might be the best support ever, but you have to get through so many levels of trolling and being called a noob. It's like I can't put my people through that. So
No, that's understandable. So I want to go back to something Steve had mentioned, and maybe Steve, you can start an answer to this question. But you had actually talked about in a previous answer to a question about sort of, giving back to the community. So what is that balance when you take on open source as part of your, let's say, video streaming or video service product? Should you be considering, like, how can we give back? How can we return innovations to the community? Is it a fork? Is it just different commits? What is it? How should it be done? Is that something that you consider when you adopt an open source project?
Yeah, I mean, I would think, I kind of think that we could all probably contribute a little bit more to open source than we do, or at least that's probably the best mentality to have, is to look kind of where we can do more on that front, because at the end of the day, most projects are people working on these things in their free time, and if these things are mission critical, it's only to your benefit to actually like encourage them to keep going and keep working on these things and make them better. I mean, there was that, was it Heartbleed or something, the issue that came up with the open source server that like everybody used this, and it was one guy working on it in his basement, and like there was some big issue, like, and that's an extreme example, but like there are opportunities to help out these open source projects, encourage them to move forward, and then the next time you're looking for an open source project, maybe something, maybe that comes back around and benefits you in that way. Now there's tons of ways to contribute without actually necessarily writing code, because it can be very difficult to actually write a patch to an open source project that gets accepted, because there's all this opinion that comes into like how the code should be written and like architecture, and like there's a lot that goes into that. And I know open source maintainers that try and be open to it and try and be the type that like are going to coach you through it, but that itself is a ton of work to just like help people understand how a project is put together and how you can contribute code back. And so if you can, awesome, like try and contribute code back to the project itself. But otherwise, like I see a lot more projects like opening up ways to even just like contribute beer money or lunch money or something like that, or yeah, just helping to answer issues. If you're an experienced user, maybe you can't write the code, but you can answer some issues that like tend to be on the simpler side of things. There's like other opportunities that if you can justify it, it's definitely helpful and I think worth it.
At Fandango, we've actually contributed to FFmpeg and to ExoPlayer, and those are hard things to contribute to and get accepted. So you're right, it's not easy to do that. But what I will say is that, well, at least for us, some of those things came out of necessity. We ran into certain situations and there wasn't support for what we needed to do. And so, as engineers, sometimes we're lazy, right? We build things so that we don't have to work on this. And so this problem that we were working on for weeks, someone decided to open up the code and kind of dig through it and see what's wrong or what could be causing this problem. And that's what came about to the contribution. And so I think there's many ways to get involved, and there's many ways to contribute to the open source community. It could come out of a problem that you're dealing with that you need solving yourself. It could come from the desire to just be cool and contribute. Our company really supports people if that is something that they want to do. And people do that on their free time, but it is hard. It's not the easiest thing to do. And I'd never even thought about ways outside of contributing code to assist, like answering questions. I know that a lot of us here as engineers or developers, we use Stack Overflow for certain things, and we're always digging in there to get answers. And I've never once thought, you know what, let me answer someone else's question. I'm relying on this community to do that. So I think that we all have a responsibility to help others just like we've been helped. And so I think it's a really important thing and an awesome thing that at least my company, we support and allow people to do that.
No, that's really cool. And it's, so the Streaming Video Alliance just launched what we call Sba Labs, which is our open source initiative. So our member companies are now building open source software around our specs. And so we just started launching this, and one of the working group chairs of open caching, where we're going to start first, is like, so how's this being governed? Like, what does that mean? And so he sends me a link. And the link was to this whole, what's a maintainer? What's a contributor? And there were so many other things that you can contribute to. You can write documentation. You can answer questions. And I was like, wow, you don't have to just write code. So I think that's really important to note, like within your organization, if you're going to adopt open source and you want to give back, it's not just about coding. You want to add something, Yuriy? Any ideas?
Well, I think going back to core question, you know, shall you contribute back? Well, first thing you should do, you should read license agreement.
If it's that old GPL stuff, you're contributing
that's
back.
simple.
Yeah, thankfully, a lot of the open source stuff now is either MIT or Apache, so it's pretty much free and clear to do what you want to. Now, so the next question I've got is kind of, it's a controversial question. So, obviously, open source is great. There are some really fantastic, you guys have already talked about sort of the idea of if it fits my project and it makes sense and it's stable and it's supported and it meets my needs and all that, yeah, why wouldn't I go open source? But, you know, does open source actually save any money? So obviously, if you do something commercial, if the commercial solution is designed well, you can drop it in pretty much out of the box. The company helps you configure it, and you're good to go. With open source, you maybe have a lot of configuration to do. So is there a balance between time to market and having total customization over a piece of your workflow? Oh, this is the tough one.
All right, I'll go first. So I think that there's no solution that is completely cost-free. If you pick an open source tool that you want to integrate into your system, obviously it's going to take time from your team to kind of learn that, figure out how it fits in, build support around that, build escalation around that, document that. There's a lot of things there. If you go with a commercial product, it might sound like it's one size fits all, but it may not be. And so there might be integration that you'll need to do to make that work within your system as well. I mentioned earlier that Fandango, because we're so focused on quality with all of our 4K content, we have to have a combination of both open source technologies and commercial. And I mentioned earlier there are different ways that we try to optimize. We might try to optimize and bring our storage down. And so we might use different systems that allow us to use the same source and package them automatically on the fly. And so we don't have to generate as many packages. Or we might use a commercial solution that might help us manage our cloud instances so that we can kind of burst up and encode more content. But a lot of these commercial solutions have the same open source tools that you would be using anyway under the hood. And so I think really there's a balance of like, what are you trying to optimize for? Are you trying to optimize for cost? Are you trying to optimize for throughput? Are you trying to optimize for time to market? Those are the questions that I think you really need to answer and figure out what solution works for you. And that solution that you pick today may not be the same solution that makes sense for you in 6 months down the line. It's something that I think needs to be constantly reevaluated to make sure that it meets your needs and optimizes what you want to optimize for.
Oh, I know, Yuriy, you look like you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the level of your involvement in that particular open source project. And let's be honest, there are open source projects which are like truly community efforts, and there are some that there is one single corporate donor that put out there, or maybe a couple of corporate donors put out there, and they still maintain most of it and entertain the process for everyone else. So in that case, of course, you will be heavily invested and you will be continuing to do lots of work, even though it's open source, but maybe there are other reasons why you go open source route, and eventually you probably will let community take over. But it's kind of depends.
On my station side, you know, we always look at everything in the cost of labor to the corporate side and what it takes us to support these products. And then you also look at the budgets for each station has its own budget. We have our budget. You go back and forth on all of that. So something, and I know I keep bringing up OBS, but you know, OBS is free. It's mature. It works very well. I've got other packages that do the exact same thing commercially of OBS that range in price from $1,500 to $10,000. So at a station level where they don't have that to spend, it's perfect for them. And then you look at other things like, I've got commercial encoders in every TV station, and they were very expensive. They're commercial. And then you always get some salesperson goes out and sells a webcam. And It's like I'm not running a $59 webcam through my $12,000 hardware encoder just so your client can have it in the player that I'm also paying impressions on because I went with a commercial player. So I use things like Red 5 or AMP Media Server, which fire up immediately, they're there, and they work. You know, I spend more time with AMP Media Server trying to remember how to renew the Let's Encrypt certificates than I did ever setting it up. So it again comes back to purpose, and broadcasting notoriously don't like to spend money, and if it works, it's mature, and it's not necessarily mission critical. A webcam of the Denver airport is not mission critical to my corporate side nor my station side. The advertiser might get upset at it's down for 10 minutes, but it's not something that we consider, you know, broadcasters are licensed to serve in the public good. Well, a webcam of the Denver airport is not necessarily the public good. So I always have to balance between the two.
It's in my public good.
There was one thing that I heard earlier that I wanted to so depending on your team and what your bread and butter is, maybe it makes sense to use open source because you'll have control over that thing. And where it's not your bread and butter, where it's totally okay to have another solution do that for you, maybe that's where you go commercial. If you make the wrong choice sometimes, the money that you spend, let's say you select a commercial solution and it does about 80% of the things you need to do. Well, in order to integrate the extra 20%, that actually is more expensive and takes more time, and all of a sudden you're over budget and you pick something that didn't necessarily work. So I think also think about your team, what your expertise is, where you want to actually spend your time, and help that make the decision. And I think that can help you decide how much money you're actually going to be spending on these solutions.
And I think Yuriy actually said that earlier too. He was like, you know, ask yourself, is this your core expertise? Like, you know, and maybe Steve, maybe you can add to this. I mean, when you were at Zencoder, I mean, I can't imagine Zencoder being built on a bunch of harmonic or elemental boxes, right? I mean, your core business was transcoding. So, like, I mean, you know, what are your thoughts on
I mean, to address, the question of when you use open source, is it actually saving money? Yes, I would say when it works, like that's not the whole point, but that's a big part of it, right? When it works, right? And it then becomes like this kind of gray area where you're evaluating, like, if it's not going to work, how much effort am I going to end up putting into it? And that's hard. That's hard to figure out exactly. So like, but I mean, I think about all these like you have all these like Node.js modules out there that just like do little things, right? And like we've had tons of projects where it's you're looking for one small thing to do, and it's going to take you like say something small, like 4 hours to write it, but because there's something out there that just does something clean, easy, you can just drop it in and never think about it again. Like I think iteratively, like those small projects ultimately and add up to saving a ton of time, a ton of money. It gets more challenging when you get into the bigger projects that are trying to do a lot of things, and do they do everything that you need?
Well, and that is the basis behind, you know, a lot of C programming, right? It's all library, it's all module. You just drop it in. Like, I don't have to program that. Somebody already did it.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense. So we got about 8 minutes left. I've got another question for them, but I want to make sure that we get to the audience for questions. Anybody have a question about sort of open source or what you're doing or what they're doing or their thoughts on stuff?
Yeah, just wondering what your thoughts are on SRT. Any of you guys have it implemented in your infrastructure?
So the question is, what do you guys think about SRT, and does anybody have it implemented in their infrastructure?
We absolutely support it as live and just.
And that's a mic drop.
Along with direct, TS over RTP or TS over RTP with SMPTE FSCs or RTMP as a worst case.
We don't support it yet, but not for any particular reason. It seems like a decent protocol. It seems like they're doing what they can to kind of open source it and make it accessible and kind of try and be the predecessor to RTMP. I think that's great. RTMP has some flaws. It works mostly. Like, I don't have a really strong reason yet myself to move away from RTMP, but, I do see some some benefits coming from, like I've seen reports from High Vision that it's twice as fast as RTMP. So like if you're streaming to an edge server, I think that can be a difference of like 0.3 seconds, which, if you're struggling with like 4 seconds of latency, maybe that's not going to make a big enough impact for you. But like if you were trying to get like really edge out like the last bit of latency in there, then yeah, it seems like it's worth checking out.
Well, there's interesting too. There's a company called Periscope which bought Adobe's flash media server business, which is it's founded by all the people who built RTMP, and they're trying to figure out like how do we bring this protocol sort of back into use. Any other questions? Okay, well, actually, thank you for that. That was a great question, and that's a perfect segue into my final question for you. So, Steve, you had mentioned earlier about, or it may not have been you, but FFmpeg adhering to some of the standards and sort of not Yuriy, okay. That's the question I have for you is what role does standards play in open source? So should you only look for open source projects that are standards based or that are adhering to standards that have been established for what that piece of software is doing, or does it matter? I mean, obviously I have my opinion being I work for an SDO, but I'd love to hear what you guys think about that. Obviously I know Yuriy has an opinion on this.
I will reserve my opinion to the last.
Yeah, I think open source should definitely be, open source projects, I think, tend to do their best to stick with the standards that are coming out. And the people who are building those projects are building those projects because they're excited about what that technology is and hypothetically then also excited about the standards that are being written about them. The problem that I've run into, though, is that open source can move so much faster than standards can. And so, sometimes they diverge. Sometimes it's just that the open source project gets so far ahead because they're trying to address problems that the standard hasn't addressed yet. And so I've seen that issue.
It goes very much on what I was going to say is that, yeah, we need the standards there and, the boards I was on and everything and working on standards. But also, if you adhere to the standards, you don't innovate. And if you're not innovating, then you're standing still. And if you get far enough in front, then you can come back to the standards boards and say, hey, this works, it works good, here's the proof, make this a standard. So it's kind of a give and take.
Okay, Yuriy, it might be all you.
Okay, well, I have to disclose first that I'm a little biased. I was a co-editor of about 7 standards in MPEG and contributed to maybe 20 of them between MPEG and ITU. And of course, coming from that background and the telecommunication field where everything starts with standards, I can't take a different position. If you're sending bits and you need to ensure interoperability on the other side of the wire, you need a standard describing what the bit stream it is. Now, a different question is, do standards limit the innovation or not? And the answer to this is depends. Some standards actually are designed very carefully to promote innovation, but for example, in domains where it's not certain how to do things. For example, MPEG standards only standardize decoders. They never standardize encoders. The encoding companies could continue using artificial intelligence, machine learning, all sorts of wonderful and crazy techniques to improve their encoders for decades after the standard is published. And there is continuous improvements in encoders as we know after each standard is produced, at least from that body. So I think it really depends. In some other forums, for example, in speech coding, both encoders and decoders are standardized exactly. So I think we need to take this case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. All right, any final questions from the audience? Oh, come right here, sure.
You talked a little bit about selection criteria and stuff like that for adopting products to whatever your tool chain or product is. Do you put much consideration into whether or not an open source project is backed by hobbyists versus by a commercial venture, right? There's a big difference in my mind between libWebRTC and FFmpeg. Like, does that even phase you, or does it change the way that you engage with the project when you're making your decisions, that kind of thing?
So just to repeat the question, does it make a difference if an open source project is sort of hobbyist versus, you know, backed by a big company in terms of selecting that project to use?
It matters. And this is, I think, part of the evaluation of the community, right? If it's backed by a bigger company and you see that they're centered around this whole thing. I mean, that could be the whole reason why that company exists, to support this. And yeah, that's important. You're making a bet. You're making a bet in that company's continued success. And yeah, that could be something that should be a part of your selection criteria. For some people, that may not matter. For me, I think it matters. I think it's important to evaluate the community, whether that is a hobbyist, whether that is a small group of engineers of a room, or whether it's a company. I think all those things should play into your selection criteria, and I do think it's important. If you do see that there's a company backing a tool that you want to use, yeah, that might make me add a couple extra points when I'm deciding what thing to use.
And it also goes if it's a company you don't trust or hate that's backing it. The biggest example I can remember is when Oracle bought MySQL. I figured by now we'd be paying $1,000 a seat, just like you do for Oracle. Oracle has actually surprised me on that and pretty much kept their hands off of it, but that scared the shit out of me when it happened. So I trust, like the hobbyists behind FFmpeg and some of these other ones. I trust them. They've been around. They're always going to be there. You know, we brought up WebRTC. I think they're always going to be there, but their interests may not stay there. You got to evaluate each one on its own merits.
Yeah, kind of pick up on what Rena was alluding to is like it's a signal, right? Like it's one thing to go off of. There's plenty of like Google projects out there that haven't been touched in 2 years, and I'm not going to use those. And then there's projects that have no big customers or big companies behind them, but they have like 1,000 contributors. I can tell that it's active, and I'm going to trust that way more than something with a big company behind it. So it certainly helps. Like, I mean, on the VideoJS project, the fact that we can say that like Brightcove uses VideoJS and is continuing to build VideoJS gives it a ton of clout, right? Like, and helps like anybody coming to adopt it from a more consumer standpoint, like gives it some trust that, oh, this thing's going to stick around for a while, and they're going to try and solve problems that I'm going to have. So yeah, it definitely helps to a degree.
All right, Yuriy, close us out.
Yeah, well, it depends which company. As some examples were brought in. I'll bring a different one. For example, in implementation of encoders, as you probably know, the speed comes from the rigor and extent to which code is translated to efficient assembly code. And if Intel is behind a project that is doing it, there is usually a good assurance that these guys will know what they're doing. And we've seen this with, for example, SVT v1 project recently, as well as SVT HVC. And frankly speaking, even before these projects, they've been open sourcing parts of media libraries for IPP, Intel performance primitives, which many proprietary companies took advantage of and turned into proprietary codecs. So
Exactly. All right, hey, listen, we're out of time. Let's give a round of applause to our awesome panel. You guys did a great job. Fantastic.